This is Trace Hunt Radio, where shocking murders meet thrilling investigations, and the hunt for killers becomes a story you can't turn away from. Listen closely, because the line between hunter and hunted is thinner than you think. When construction workers broke ground in a quiet city park, they expected pipes, stones, maybe forgotten debris. What they didn't expect was iron, a sealed, ornate coffin buried deep beneath the soil. Inside lay the body of a young girl, so perfectly preserved that she seemed to be only sleeping. Her hair still neatly braided, her delicate shoes still laced. Locals quickly dubbed her the Iron Coffin Girl. At first, experts believed they had stumbled upon an ordinary 19th century burial. But as forensic teams examined the coffin, disturbing questions emerged. The girl's lungs showed signs of suffocation. Her fingernails bore scratches, not from age or decay, but from desperate scraping against the coffin's interior. She hadn't died before burial. She had been sealed alive. What was the purpose of the iron coffin, a device used rarely and at great cost? Who was the girl entombed inside, and why had her death been hidden beneath layers of secrecy? Was it a tragic accident, a medical misdiagnosis of death, or something darker, a deliberate act meant to silence her forever? Tonight, we open the case of the Iron Coffin Girl, peeling back layers of history, folklore, and forensic science to uncover one of the most chilling discoveries ever unearthed beneath city streets. The summer sun beat down on the city park as the construction crew moved in, machines roaring and shovels striking against the packed earth. It was supposed to be a routine job, digging foundations for a new utility line. A week of dust and noise before the project shifted deeper underground. Workers joked as they dug, expecting to hit nothing but rock and pipes. But by mid-morning, the rhythm of metal against soil changed. A hollow clang rang out, different from stone. At first, they thought it was an old oil drum. Then the foreman barked at them to stop. What they had struck was too solid, too heavy, and too carefully made. The crew brushed away the dirt and revealed a rectangle of blackened metal, its surface mottled with rust but intact despite the decades. It was nearly 6 feet long, with decorative moldings along the sides, a shape instantly recognizable to anyone who dared admit it. A coffin. Not wood, not stone, iron. Silence fell over the site. Some men swore and stepped back. Others leaned in, curiosity pulling stronger than fear. The police arrived first, called in by the nervous foreman. Soon after came city officials, historians, and eventually, forensic specialists in pale gloves and masks. The crowd of onlookers grew along the park's fence, whispers passing like static. They found a body, buried in iron. For the workers, it felt like stumbling into a ghost story. For the investigators, it was the beginning of something much stranger. When the lid was finally pried open, a hiss of stale air escaped, and then the sight that froze everyone in place. Inside lay a young girl, no older than 10 or 11, her skin pale but intact, her braided hair still shining, her clothing as crisp as if it had been dressed yesterday. It looked impossible, like a child placed in a coffin only hours before. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters later called it the child who slept in iron, but closer inspection would shatter that illusion. Her hands were clenched into fists, her nails ragged and broken. The interior of the coffin bore faint scratches. She had not been peacefully laid to rest. she had fought for air in her final moments. That discovery turned the excavation into a crime scene. The girl was not only a historical curiosity, but a mystery, possibly a victim. Officials faced a question no one was prepared to answer. How had she ended up here, hidden beneath a public park in an iron coffin, preserved as if waiting for someone to find her? The body was lifted carefully from the earth, the iron coffin placed under a white tent that fluttered with the murmur of reporters and curious locals pressing at the edges. Forensic teams worked slowly, their movements reverent. It wasn't every day they were handed a body that looked more asleep than dead, one that defied time itself. The sight of the girl unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. She was dressed in a simple but well-made gown, its fabric remarkably intact. The kind of garment a family of modest means might save for Sunday best. Her shoes were still tied, tiny leather boots with scuffed toes. A ribbon bound her braided hair, dark against pale cheeks that had not withered into bone. Her lips were parted slightly, as though she might sigh at any moment. But what drew the forensic team's eyes first were her hands. Both were curled into fists, nails chipped and ragged, the flesh beneath dark with bruising. Along the interior lid of the coffin, scratches had etched desperate arcs into the metal. Some were shallow, others bit deep, almost to the point of drawing sparks in her final struggle. It was clear she had not been dead when placed inside. Theories formed quickly. In the 19th century, medical science had a grim flaw. Premature burials were not uncommon. Disease victims were sometimes misdiagnosed as dead, only to awaken beneath earth and coffin lid. Could she have been such a case, sealed in iron by mistake? Yet doubts lingered. Iron coffins were rare and expensive, often used by wealthy families to preserve the dead during transport or to display status. Why would a child of modest dress rest in one? Tests began immediately. Forensic pathologists noted faint hemorrhaging in her lungs, suggesting asphyxiation. Her bones showed no trauma, no signs of violence, but her body told a story of suffocation, of air running out in a chamber that was both her tomb and her prison. The preservation only added to the unease. Unlike wooden coffins, iron sealed the body airtight. In death, it had denied her decay, but in life it had denied her escape. Further study revealed something more chilling: traces of wax along the coffin seams, as if it had been deliberately sealed to prevent even the faintest whiff of air. This was not the mark of a simple burial accident. This suggested intent. Whoever placed the girl inside may have known she was alive. Investigators pored over local records, tracing families, churchyards, and cemeteries that had once bordered the park. The land had been repurposed many times, and paper trails had faded. Still, hints emerged. A child missing from census rolls, whispers of a fever outbreak that had carried off dozens, and rumors of a prominent local family that vanished suddenly after scandal. The girl's face seemed to belong to all of them and none, a puzzle locked behind eyes that would never open again. Forensic artists reconstructed her likeness, softening pallor into lifelike skin, widening her faintly parted lips into a tentative smile. When her image was released to the public, it spread like wildfire. Some swore they had seen her in old portraits hung in attics. Others claimed their grandparents had spoken of a child buried in iron, cursed to never decay. The city was captivated, haunted by the idea of a girl sealed alive, hidden beneath their feet for more than a century. But fascination soon gave way to suspicion. Was she a victim of tragic error? Or had she been entombed deliberately, silenced for reasons buried as deep as her coffin? The scratches in iron whispered the truth. Whatever story was told on paper, she had known terror, she had fought, and she had died clawing against her cage. Before the park was swings and dog walkers and Saturday picnics, it had been edges of parishes, of neighborhoods, of maps drawn by men with ink-stained fingers who treated margins like dumping grounds for the inconvenient dead. The task force split in two. One team stayed with the girl, logging every thread and rivet. The other went hunting through paper. They started in the records room beneath City Hall, where the air tasted like dust and old glue, pulling Sanborn fire maps and faded plats that showed the parkland in paler versions of itself. Orchards, then brickyards, then a square labeled simply Potter's Church Ground. The boundary lines wavered across years, but one thing held. This patch of earth had once been crowded with graves. A city archivist with a memory like a card catalog slid a box across the table. Inside were church minutes and a ledger bound in cracked calfskin from St. Bridget's, the small parish whose spire used to throw a morning shadow over the field. The minutes from 1889 sounded pious and practical until you read between the lines. Burying ground to be closed forthwith. Remains to be translated to the new cemetery on Broad. Expenses shared betwixt parish and municipal. In the margin, a note in different ink. Wooden caskets to be prioritized. Metallic cases require special cartage. That last phrase snagged like a fishhook. In an age of rot and splinters, iron was uncommon and expensive. Someone had paid extra to keep air out. Ground-penetrating radar came next. A university team dragged the unit over the grass at dawn before the park woke. On the monitor, the soil bloomed in false color. Blue voids where roots had tunneled, wide orange blurs where Victorian trash pits slept, and a series of slim, regular anomalies in parallel rows. Most read as exactly what time would make of pine, collapsed voids where coffins had long since fallen in on themselves. But here and there flashed hard returns, tiny metal signatures, coffin nails or hinges, ghost punctuation in a sentence written in earth. Only one target rang with a solid coffin-length echo of density, the iron case they had already opened. The rest had dissolved into soil decades ago. If St. Bridget's had moved their dead, they had not moved all of them. In the parish ledger, the names ticked by in careful hands. Infants taken by summer fevers, sailors who never made it past winter coughs, washerwomen who worked themselves to bone. Beside some entries, a symbol, a cross for sacrament, a star for stillborns. Toward the back, a different mark appeared beside 3 burials in a single week, a little circle bisected by a line. The archivist narrowed his eyes. "That's a quarantine mark," he said. "Used during outbreaks. Cholera, yellow fever, smallpox if you go back far enough." The dates matched a newspaper clipping someone had thumbtacked to the box lid years ago. Summer scourge returns. City Hastens interments. Families were urged to bury quickly. Doctors erred on the side of haste. A nightmare of the age was premature burial. The iron coffin had been sold, in pamphlets of the time, as salvation against miasma and desecration, Fisk's metallic burial case, with an oval viewing window and a promise to keep the body intact for transport. It also kept air out. Mistake and malice wear the same mask when sealed in metal. They kept pulling threads. At the Historical Society, a volunteer produced a slim, misfiled book from a box labeled Undertakers, Sundry. The cover was stamped Arbuthnot and Son in gold, the kind of craftsman's pride that survives when owners do not. Inside, in copperplate too neat for the grave dirt trade, were columns: name, age, residence, coffin type, fee, conveyance, notes, Pine dominated the pages, occasionally walnut, rarely zinc. The ledger hiccuped near the date of the parish's quarantine mark. 3 entries sat like teeth in a jaw. 2 pine, common, quickly interred, and 1 with a different weight to it. Metallic case, iron, child, paid by gentleman for immediate sealing, oval window, omitted by request. No name. Just a fee 3 times the others and a note. Delivered after Vespers to St. Bridget's Yard, waxed at seam per instruction. The hair on the back of the lead detective's neck rose. Wax at the seam. Not only airtight on purpose. City directories gave Arbuthnot an address. The shop had become a corner deli and then nothing at all. The stoop mended with concrete. Its sign long since painted over. But in a basement storage bin behind the deli's stockroom, a carpenter's descendant had stashed things he hadn't had the heart to throw away. Corroded coffin plates, iron lugs, a box of blackened screws, and a folded broadside advertising the very metallic cases in all their macabre finery, promising no odors, no corruption, no pestilence. In spidery script across the bottom edge, someone had calculated a price and underlined it twice. The number matched the ledger's fee. Back at the park, the team marked out the old rows with string and flags. They found a scatter of coffin nails and the occasional button crushed flat as a coin. Near the iron coffin's pit, a child stooped and plucked something from the dirt. A ring woven of hair encased beneath glass, the sort of mourning jewelry Victorians wore on chains against their throats. A conservator lifted it with breath, held as though it might sigh. On the underside, too faint to see without light at an angle, lay an inscription. E.L. 2 letters, the only name anyone had. A city historian brought cemetery transfer receipts from the 1890s. Crisp lists of names, coffins disinterred and relocated to Broad Street, neat as ledger lines. Many of St. Bridget's dead had been exhumed by crews paid by the grave. Mistakes were inevitable, indifference cheaper than care. A clerk's brown ink notation made the detectives swear under their breath. 1 metallic case, deferred, family to arrange private removal. No family name, no follow-up. Iron costs money to move. Iron also keeps secrets where pine collapses. It was easier to let the city build a park on top and forget where the bones lay. They visited the diocesan archive, a room of polished tables and severe portraits. The archivist there wore gloves like a surgeon and disapproved on principle. But even he softened over the ledger with the bisected quarantine circle. He pointed to a separate register required of parishes during pestilence years. Cases of suspicious death. Most were routine, fever, flux, colic, and most carried absolutions written in Latin. 1 entry bloomed like a bruise. Female child, age uncertain, brought by guardian, examined by Dr. J.L., insensible, immediate interment urged. At the far right margin, a priest's small hand added, as if to his own conscience, window closed, against custom. The iron coffins of the Fisk pattern had that oval glass at the face. Closing it was unusual. Sealing wax at the seam was not sacrament. The phrase tasted like deliberation. Who was the guardian? City tax rolls from that decade listed a lawyer named Ephraim Lyle, living 3 streets off the parish, a widower with no children, and a household that changed servants often. The initials matched the ring. He had donated to the parish, paid for a pew near the front, and held city bonds. His name also appeared in an orphanage ledger as the man who posted surety for 2 children that summer, a boy and a girl taken into his care. Their origins listed as unknown. The boy resurfaced later. He enlisted at 16 and died at sea. The girl's name line was crossed out in the orphanage book and replaced with a single word, interred. The task force stood in the bright, ordinary park with photocopies that made the light feel wrong. A child in iron, a guardian with means, a priest who had written against custom, an undertaker who had omitted the viewing window and waxed the seam. Mistake can be sloppy. This had been tidy. Too tidy. They carried the iron coffin's lid under museum lights and found, beneath the rust and scratches, a faint manufacturer's stamp. Fisk Patent, Number 4, Hudson River Works. Rare but not exotic. The city had been a rail hub on a busy river, but along the rim, stamped even fainter, lay a retailer's mark. Arbuthnot, Waverly Saint. That completed the loop. The undertaker had ordered the case, sealed it with wax, delivered it after Vespers, and noted, by gentlemen. The parish had allowed the burial and recorded the closure of the viewing port against custom. A year later, when the city moved its dead, a clerk pushed one metallic case into the column of deferred removal. The girl had slept through land sales and picnics because adults with pens had given her to the ground and then allowed forgetfulness to do the rest. They needed a name they could speak aloud. The initials EL on the ring might have belonged to the guardian as easily as the child. The orphanage log held only a first name, Lydia, written once and then struck. Beside it, a smudge where a surname might have been begun and abandoned. Beneath the smudge, the matron had left a tiny symbol, half a circle with a line through it. The same quarantine mark, Lydia L. The detectives looked at one another and saw the next day's work sharpen into a point. Before they left the archive, the parish archivist allowed them a final page, a list of memorial donations given after the summer scourge. Most gifts were small: candles, bread, a shawl for a widow. One line stood apart, the ink darker, the numbers larger. From Mr. E. Lyle, for a new lock on the churchyard gate, to prevent desecration. The lock was meant to keep people out. It had also kept one child in. By twilight, the flags marking grave rows fluttered above the grass, like a field of small white tongues. Dog walkers paused and whispered. A bus hissed and moved on. In the pit where the iron coffin had lain, the soil settled as if exhaling. The team packed maps and ledgers and hairwork ring into boxes and wrote a single sentence across the top of the case file in block letters. A truth as old as churchyards and as new as the light on their screens. This was never just a burial. In the morning, they would knock on the heavy door of the law library and ask for the probate of Ephraim Lyle, whose pen had signed more lives than anyone then realized. Somewhere, in a will or a ledger or a private letter slipped into a book, would be the name the iron had kept. The girl had been sealed alive, and by iron and ink, sealed into forgetting. If they were careful and relentless, the cemetery that time tried to erase would give her back. The name Arbuthnot became the investigator's anchor, the thread tying iron, ink, and intention into something sharper than folklore. On the surface, he had been just an undertaker, one of many who advertised Fisk's metallic burial cases when they became the height of modern fashion in the mid-1800s. But as detectives traced his ledgers, advertisements, and private correspondence, a more unsettling portrait emerged. This was not merely a businessman selling coffins. Arbuthnot had been a craftsman of secrecy, a broker of burials that were meant never to be remembered. His workshop records, miraculously preserved in the basement of the former shop, listed dozens of ordinary burials. Yet several entries were curiously vague. Child, metallic, no plate, seam sealed. Others omitted names entirely, billing only guardian or gentleman. Iron coffins were never common. They were expensive, heavy, impractical. but Arbuthnot's book suggested he provided them disproportionately often, and not to families who could have afforded them openly. The clientele seemed select, discreet, and insistent. One brittle letter tucked into the ledger spoke volumes. Addressed to Mr. E. Lyle, it read, "Per your request, I have sealed the case without the customary viewing port. Wax applied, lock reinforced. Delivery by Vespers as arranged. Please remit balance within the week. Respectfully, J. Arbuthnot." In tidy script across the bottom margin was a chilling note. Child did not stir after placement. Family reassured. The phrasing struck the detectives like a blow. Why note whether the child stirred unless it was a possibility? Arbuthnot had been not only a coffin maker, but a witness to suffocation. Historians weighed in. Fisk coffins had been marketed not just for preservation, but as morbid curiosities. Some families used the viewing window to display the dead for weeks. But Arbuthnot's clients seemed eager to close windows, to seal lids in wax. The detectives began to suspect a hidden economy. Wealthy men silencing inconvenient wards, heirs, or dependents by placing them into airtight tombs disguised as expensive funerals. A child who cried too much, a girl who knew too many secrets, an orphan who stood in the way of inheritance. All could vanish behind iron plates, their absence explained by fever, their bodies sealed where no rot or smell would betray haste. And Arbuthnot? He profited twice, once from the inflated fee, and again from silence. His surviving account book contained not only payments received, but debts erased. Entries marked "settled by arrangement," suggesting favors traded in exchange for complicity. The Iron Coffin Girl, investigators realized, was not a tragic accident of medical misdiagnosis. She was part of a pattern, a system of calculated erasures. Arbuthnot had provided the means, but men like Ephraim Lyle had provided the motive. And together, they had written children into the soil as though they were ledgers balanced with wax and iron. The team stared at the pages late into the night, the words etched more deeply than ink could show. They were no longer dealing with one coffin, one girl, one mistake. They were confronting an industry of silence, a forgotten trade in lives buried alive under the guise of preservation. Somewhere in those ledgers, in those wax-sealed seams, lay the answer to who the girl had been, and why she was condemned to an iron tomb beneath the city. The name Ephraim Lyle kept returning like a refrain in the documents, sometimes neatly inscribed, sometimes reduced to the initials EL, other times half-scratched as if the clerk himself hesitated to record it. He was not a faceless guardian. He was a man whose hand seemed to close around the Iron Coffin Girl's fate. Detectives pieced together his life from brittle wills, census rolls, and yellowed newspapers. Born into a modest merchant family, Lyle had risen through law, collecting clients as he collected debts. By the 1880s, he was a widower in his late 40s, childless but flush with influence. Parish records showed his pew at St. Bridget's paid in advance, a gesture both of piety and power. But what unsettled the task force most was his role as legal guardian for several orphans in the city, children who arrived through the church, through the orphan asylum, through quiet arrangements made when parents died in epidemics. 2 names leapt from the orphanage log: Lydia, age 10, and her brother Thomas, 12. They had been taken into Lyle's care during the fever outbreak. Thomas appeared again years later on a ship's muster roll, a cabin boy who never returned from sea. Lydia's line ended abruptly with the word "interred." There were whispers in the archive, scrawled notes from parish minutes that spoke of Lyle's ward, delicate health, and rumors of improper confinement. One priest had written in Latin a phrase that chilled modern readers: Puella sepulta viva, the girl buried alive. Investigators reconstructed the weeks leading to Lydia's disappearance. Ephraim Lyle had purchased the Iron Coffin through Arbuthnot and Son. He had paid extra for wax seals and demanded the viewing window be omitted. At the same time, his law firm handled a dispute over an estate in which Lydia, as surviving kin to distant cousins, might have stood to inherit. If she vanished quietly, that wealth funneled elsewhere, through guardianship, through Lyle himself. Neighbors described him as meticulous, solitary, always carrying a cane topped with a polished knob. He walked with a slight stiffness in the hip, a man of habits and control. Children in his household were seldom seen outside. Servants came and went in silence. Was Lydia truly a victim of medical misdiagnosis, declared dead in haste during quarantine? Or had Lyle, calculating and cold, ensured she would never rise again to claim what was hers? The wax on the seams, the absence of her name in the undertaker's book, the initials in the mourning ring. They all pointed toward intent, not error. In the end, what remained of Lyle was ink and suspicion. His probate records listed no heirs, only donations to the parish and a final bequest for the upkeep of the very gate that had locked the cemetery. His will contained one final clause: "May those I have provided for rest in peace, never to be disturbed." It read less like a blessing than a command. The girl in iron had not been provided for. She had been imprisoned, silenced, and buried beneath his signature. And though time had tried to erase her, the guardian's hand still pressed down across the centuries, until investigators pried open the lid and let her story breathe again. Forensics had come a long way since the 19th century, when a doctor's word could seal a coffin and a priest's blessing could bury a secret. Now, with the Iron Coffin Girl preserved in uncanny detail, modern science was ready to speak for her in ways her own voice never could. The body was transferred to a climate-controlled lab, where every fiber, bone, and trace of air was logged. Specialists approached her like a time capsule cracked open too early. CT scans revealed the contours of her skull, the fragile bones of her wrists, even the alignment of her teeth. Dental analysis placed her age between 10 and 11. Her growth plates confirmed the estimate. Her lungs, preserved by the coffin's airtight seal, were dark with signs of fluid buildup, consistent with suffocation. But there were no lesions of disease, no marks of cholera or yellow fever, as officials of her era had claimed during the outbreak. Tissue samples revealed more. Under the microscope, her fingernails were splintered inward, pressure fractures caused by repeated scraping. The fingertips bore microscopic traces of iron, matching the scratches carved into the coffin's interior. She had fought until the last gasp. Chemical analysis of her hair told another story. Strands captured traces of arsenic, lead, and mercury, common poisons, but also common medicines of the time. Arsenic had been used in tonics, lead in cosmetics, mercury in calomel pills. Too much of any could cause weakness, dizziness, fainting spells mistaken for death. Had Lydia been dosed into a stupor that mimicked lifelessness, then sealed away under the guise of fever? Forensic anthropologists reconstructed her face digitally, softening the pallor of death into the roundness of a living child. The rendering was eerily close to the girl pulled from iron, a face both familiar and unknown, a face that belonged to someone who had once laughed, run, and dreamed. When the image was shown to descendants of families in the parish, some swore she resembled portraits still tucked in attics. Stable isotope analysis of her teeth added yet another layer. It traced the minerals she absorbed as a child, showing she had grown up in the city itself, not as a transient orphan from elsewhere. She was a daughter of the very streets that later forgot her. The coffin itself became evidence too. The wax used on the seams was tested, beeswax mixed with resin, applied thickly to ensure a seal. This was not accidental, it was intentional. The window's absence was damning. Fisk coffins were designed with a viewing port, but Arbuthnot had covered it over at Lyle's request. To the forensic team, it was clear. This was no error of medicine. This was entombment disguised as burial. Even the air inside the coffin told a story. When first opened, samples had been collected. Gas chromatography revealed carbon dioxide levels many times higher than normal, oxygen nearly depleted. It confirmed what her nails already told. She had breathed in the dark until there was no breath left to take. Science could not name her guardian's motives. It could not write intent into the record. But it could strip away every excuse of accident. She had not died of plague. She had not died of misdiagnosis. She had died fighting inside an iron coffin sealed tight by human hands. The investigators gathered the reports into binders, photographs into folders, scans into digital archives. Each page added weight to the truth. The girl in iron had been murdered, and her murderer had used the technology of preservation to achieve the opposite: obliteration. For the first time in more than a century, Lydia, or whatever her true name had been, was no longer a rumor, no longer a ghost beneath the park. She was evidence. She was testimony, and she was impossible to silence any longer. The iron coffin had given Lydia back her face, her bones, her final struggle. But to restore her name and story, the investigators turned to the places that once held her living presence. The orphanage ledgers, the parish minutes, the yellowed testimonies of those who had once brushed shoulders with her in crowded dormitories and shadowed halls. The orphanage itself no longer stood. Its bricks had been carted away decades earlier, its site paved over by apartments that knew nothing of the children once housed there. But archives preserved its paper skeleton: admission logs, expense receipts, reports written in spidery script by matrons too exhausted to disguise their fatigue. In the log for the year of the fever outbreak, 2 names appeared together: Thomas and Lydia, children of no fixed parentage, delivered by the parish and placed under the guardianship of Ephraim Lyle. The entry was smudged, as if a clerk's pen had slipped. Thomas appeared again later, assigned work duties, enrolled in basic schooling, noted for good penmanship. Lydia's line ended abruptly, where later entries recorded meals and chores for other children. Hers was crossed through with a single word: interred. The investigators dug deeper. Scattered among the orphanage's papers were reports of missing children, wards who vanished without explanation, their names erased from rosters, their belongings quietly redistributed. Most had explanations attached: runaway, adopted, deceased. But a few, like Lydia, were marked only by silence. Former staff records led the detectives to descendants of those who had once worked at the orphanage. An old woman, granddaughter of a matron, produced a bundle of letters her ancestor had saved. One, dated weeks after Lydia's disappearance, spoke of a gentleman's ward placed in metallic confinement, despite the child's protests of life. The matron had written, "I heard her cries myself. They hushed me with threats, but God helped me. I wrote it here so she will not be forgotten." The ink was shaky, the confession buried in private correspondence, but it was enough to prove others had seen what happened and been forced into silence. Rumors circulated in the parish too. Oral histories, recorded by local folklorists in the 1930s, told of a girl sealed in a box of iron by her guardian, lest she inherit what was not meant for her. Many dismissed it as ghost story, a cautionary tale. But paired with the forensic evidence, the myth aligned chillingly with fact. Investigators compiled names of other children whose fates had been suspiciously vague. One boy listed as adopted abroad was never found in immigration records. Another girl recorded as fever casualty had no burial entry in the parish registers. Patterns emerged. Children placed with guardians of means, children tied to estates or inheritances, children whose absence benefited adults. The orphanage, meant as refuge, had been a marketplace for guardians who saw wards as property. Ephraim Lyle had not been alone in exploiting it, but he had left behind the most damning evidence. The coffin sealed in iron, hidden beneath the city, never meant to be found. By the time the chapter of the orphanage was pieced together, the investigators knew Lydia's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was one echo in a chorus of children erased by paper, silence, and complicity. The Iron Coffin Girl had become the face of all of them, the child who refused to decay, who forced the truth to surface long after everyone who betrayed her had turned to dust. Had Lydia's coffin been opened in her own century, had the scratches been seen by her neighbors, her cries overheard by anyone but silenced matrons, the case might have become one of the most infamous trials of the Victorian age. But it never was. Justice, like air in her iron tomb, had been sealed away. Ephraim Lyle, wealthy lawyer and parish patron, lived in a society where reputation was currency. Courts bent to men of his standing. Guardianship laws granted sweeping power. Once a child was assigned to a man's care, the orphan ceased to be an individual in the eyes of the law and became almost an extension of his household. Records show that guardians could sign contracts, approve labor, even arrange marriages on behalf of their wards. The law assumed guardians acted in the child's best interest, a phrase as elastic as a noose when money and property were at stake. Had suspicions arisen in Lydia's time, they would have run into a wall of authority. A priest might testify to her burial during a fever outbreak. Arbuthnot the undertaker would have presented receipts signed in proper ink. Neighbors who doubted would be dismissed as gossips. And Lydia herself, the only one who could tell the truth, was sealed away. Her body prevented from decay, but her voice extinguished. The courtroom would have seen only polished affidavits, not scratches in iron. Newspapers of the age, combed through by modern researchers, revealed how fragile truth was in print. Headlines screamed of fevers vanquished and city restored to health. Nowhere was there mention of a missing orphan girl or of a guardian who profited from her disappearance. Even if whispers circulated, no editor would risk scandal against a man whose law firm handled half the city's estates. Silence was safer. By the time investigators uncovered the coffin more than a century later, the chance for trial had passed. Ephraim Lyle was long dead, his estate scattered, his bones dust in the same soil that had held his ward. Arbuthnot's workshop had vanished. Priests who had signed burial registers lay in their own graves. Witnesses who might have spoken had either been threatened into silence or carried their confessions to deathbeds. And yet, in a sense, a trial did take place, unofficial, posthumous, conducted in the court of history. Forensic science became prosecutor, laying out evidence, suffocation, nail scratches, wax seals, absence of disease. Archival records became witness, their ink recounting the haste, the omission of names, the deliberate closure of the coffin's window. The jury was the public, horrified by the revelation that a child had been buried alive, not by tragic mistake but by design. Historians argued whether men like Lyle should be condemned outright. Some cautioned against imposing modern morality on a past era, but others countered that cruelty, greed, and betrayal of children were not inventions of modern conscience. They were eternal crimes. The absence of a trial in Lydia's time was not proof of innocence, only of power. The phrase, "the trial that never was," became shorthand for her story in documentaries and articles. It symbolized not only her lost justice, but the failures of an entire system that allowed wealth to silence the weak. Lydia was never granted a day in court, but through the iron coffin she forced the world to reopen her case. A century too late, but not too late to remember. Her scratches on the lid became her testimony. Her last desperate plea transformed into evidence no judge could strike from the record. And though no gavel ever fell in her time, history rendered its verdict. She was murdered by guardianship and sealed by silence. Long before investigators gave her a name, before forensic science told her story, the people of the city had whispered of her. The Iron Coffin Girl may have been buried in darkness, but her memory bled through in ways the living could not fully explain. Children in the neighborhood grew up with tales of a girl who slept beneath the park, her knuckles rapping against the ground on stormy nights. Mothers warned their little ones not to wander after dusk, saying, "The girl in the coffin will catch you if you don't come home." Teenagers dared each other to lie in the grass where the coffin was eventually found, swearing they felt a vibration beneath the soil, as if someone was still clawing to get out. Local folklore often entwines with fact, and in Lydia's case the boundaries blurred until discovery proved the legends had teeth. For decades, elderly parishioners had insisted that one child during the fever outbreak had been buried differently. They remembered the undertaker's cart at twilight, the glint of iron, the priest's hurried prayers. Some claimed they had seen the guardian himself, Ephraim Lyle, standing at the graveside with a lantern, not in mourning, but in watchful calculation. Ghost stories gathered around her resting place like moths to flame. Couples strolling through the park spoke of hearing faint sobs carried on the wind. Dogs refused to cross the patch of grass above her coffin, growling low as though scenting something wrong. In one recorded oral history, a retired groundskeeper confessed he had always avoided digging too deeply there, claiming his shovel struck hollow metal once and rang like a church bell underground. When her coffin was unearthed and photographs of her preserved body were shown on the evening news, the city shuddered. Folklore turned into fact overnight. The scratches in iron matched the old tales of her desperate knocking. The suffocation confirmed the whispers of a child buried alive. What had been dismissed as ghost story was revealed as collective memory refusing to die. The discovery reignited the haunting in new forms. The park became a site of quiet pilgrimage, with flowers laid at the chain-link fence. True crime enthusiasts traced her story across podcasts and documentaries, while paranormal groups set up cameras and recorders, hoping to capture her voice. Children who once whispered about her ghost now carried her name into classrooms, essays, and history projects. She was no longer just a specter. She was a symbol. Lydia's haunting legacy was not just supernatural, but moral. Her story came to represent every child silenced by guardianship, every orphan erased by ink, every victim denied justice by time. The iron coffin became a metaphor for secrets societies seal away, believing the earth will keep them safe. But Earth remembers. Even today, when the wind rattles the trees above the old cemetery ground, locals say you can hear her if you listen closely. A faint scrape, a breathless sigh, the echo of nails on iron. It is not just haunting, it is testimony. And the city, at last, cannot pretend it doesn't hear. The case began with iron, silence, and a child who seemed to have no name. For months, investigators called her the Iron Coffin Girl, as if she were an artifact rather than a person. But as the evidence grew, a mourning ring with initials, a smudged entry in an orphanage log, a priest's furtive Latin note, her outline sharpened. She was not anonymous. She was not forgotten. She had been erased, and the task now was to write her back into history. Historians and genealogists worked in tandem, tracing fragments across archives like threads through a labyrinth. Parish records yielded the faint name Lydia. Census documents aligned her with a brother, Thomas, who vanished to sea. Probate papers revealed Ephraim Lyle's guardianship and the estates that might have passed through her small hands had she lived. No single document declared her identity, but together, the evidence whispered with enough strength to convince: Lydia Lyle, ward, orphan, child, silenced in iron. The naming was more than clerical. It was resurrection. On the day her reconstructed likeness was unveiled at the City Museum, the crowd fell silent. The digital rendering showed a girl with solemn eyes and braided hair, the same face found sleeping in her coffin. For the first time in over a century, she was called by name. Visitors left notes and flowers by her display, messages scrawled on scraps of paper. You are remembered. You are free. The city council voted to erect a memorial at the park where she had been found. Not a statue, but a simple plaque etched with her name, the date of her discovery, and the truth the earth had given back. She was buried alive, but not forgotten. The investigators closed their file with a final note. Cause of death: asphyxiation. Manner: homicide. The words came too late for courts or prisons, but not too late for justice of another kind. The justice of memory, of truth restored against silence. In the end, Lydia became more than victim. She became symbol. Teachers told her story in classrooms as a caution against blind trust in authority. True crime scholars cited her as proof that the past never stays buried. Her face, once hidden in darkness, became part of the city's identity, an emblem of resilience in the face of injustice. The iron coffin, once meant to silence her forever, had preserved the very evidence that condemned her killer. Wax and steel conspired to suffocate her, but they also cheated time, ensuring her testimony would survive when voices failed. Her scratches became words. Her coffin became courtroom. Her name, once struck from ledgers, returned in stone and memory. And so, the final curtain closed, not on silence, but on remembrance. Lydia's story ended not where the guardian's hand sealed her away, but where the city unearthed her truth. The ashes of time had tried to bury her, but her name burned through, refusing to vanish. Lydia Lyle, the Iron Coffin Girl, was no longer a ghost. She was history, carved into iron, and finally, into us.